The truth always shows up at the worst possible moment. And for Emily Carter, it showed up the night she lost everything. The grip on her arm wasn't rough, but it was firm enough to make it clear she didn't belong there. Not in a place like this. Not in a mansion worth over $10 million where every window glowed like something out of a dream she was never supposed to touch. And yet just hours ago she had been standing inside, heart racing for a completely different reason, because just days earlier her life had looked nothing like this. She had been in a small apartment barely 600 square feet, sharing space and bills with Jason Miller, the man she thought she would marry, the man she trusted, the man she believed was saving up for a ring, until she walked in early from work one afternoon and heard laughter that didn't belong to her, saw a pair of unfamiliar heels by the door, and felt something in her chest crack before she even opened the bedroom door. And when she did, everything changed in a single breath. Not because of what she saw, but because of how easily he looked at her. Afterward, like she was the one who had interrupted something important, like she was already replaceable. And within 48 hours she was packing her things into 2 worn suitcases, leaving behind a life that suddenly felt like a lie, taking the only job she could get fast enough to keep herself afloat, cleaning pools in neighborhoods she used to drive past without ever imagining she would step inside, long hours under the sun, the smell of chlorine clinging to her skin, pretending she didn't notice the way people looked through her instead of at her, until the day she arrived at the Hayes estate. A property so massive it felt like its own private world, manicured lawns stretching for acres, a pool that looked more like a resort than anything built for a single person. And that was where she met Alexander Hayes for the first time, standing at the edge of the water in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to show he wasn't afraid of getting his hands dirty, but his eyes told a different story, sharp, observant, the kind of man who didn't miss details and definitely didn't trust easily. And when he looked at her, really looked at her, it wasn't admiration or kindness she saw. It was suspicion, like he had already decided who she was before she even said a word. Just another girl looking for an opportunity, just another distraction, and Emily felt that familiar sting rise again, the same one she felt when Jason chose someone else over her. But this time she didn't shrink, she didn't look away, she met Alex's gaze and held it just long enough to make something shift in the air between them. Something neither of them expected, and maybe that was the moment everything started to change, because neither of them knew yet that the same place that brought them together would soon be the place that tore them apart. And now as she stood outside those towering gates with the evening air turning colder against her skin, watching the man who once looked at her like she mattered turn away like she was nothing, Emily realized the truth wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about what people choose to believe when it matters most, and whether love can survive the moment trust breaks in front of your eyes. The moment you realize someone believed a lie about you is the moment everything inside you goes quiet. And as Emily Carter stood just beyond the iron gates of the Hayes estate, that silence was louder than anything she had ever felt before, because hours ago those same gates had opened for her like she belonged there, like she had finally stepped into a life that did not constantly push her back out, and now they were closing, slowly, deliberately, as if erasing her from a world she was never supposed to enter in the first place. And she could still see him through the distance, Alexander Hayes, standing on the terrace without moving, without calling her name, without even questioning what he had just been told. And that was the part that hurt the most, not the accusations, not the embarrassment, but the fact that he did not fight for the truth, because just a few days ago things had felt different in a way she had not expected. It started small, almost unnoticeable, like the way he stopped watching her with suspicion and started noticing the details she thought no one cared about, the way she showed up early, the way she stayed late to make sure everything was perfect, the way she never touched anything that was not part of her job, even when surrounded by more wealth than she had ever seen in her life. And one afternoon when the sun was dropping low and painting everything gold, he asked her a question that caught her off guard. Not about the pool, not about the work, but about why she chose this job, and for a second she almost gave him the easy answer, the safe answer. But something about the way he looked at her made her tell the truth instead, that she did not choose it, that she needed it. And that was the first time his expression changed, not into pity, but into something quieter, something that felt like understanding. And from that moment the space between them shifted, conversations became longer, Glances lingered just a little more, and Emily found herself forgetting, even if only for a few minutes at a time, what it felt like to be left behind. And then came the night everything unraveled, when Jason Miller showed up uninvited, standing at the edge of that same perfect pool with a confidence that made her stomach drop before he even spoke, spinning a story so smooth and convincing that it sounded like truth if you did not know better, painting Emily as someone who planned everything, someone who used people, someone who saw Alex not as a person but as an opportunity, and she tried to speak, tried to explain, but the timing, the setting, the weight of her past made every word sound weaker than his. And when she turned to Alex, hoping, needing him to see through it, to remember who she had been every single day he watched her, she saw hesitation, doubt creeping into his eyes. And in that moment, she understood something she had not wanted to believe, that no matter how real something feels, it can disappear the second trust cracks. And now, as she stood alone with nothing but the sound of the gates locking behind her, Emily took a slow breath, forcing herself not to look back again, because if he did not choose to believe her when it mattered, then maybe the hardest truth she had to accept was that this story was never meant to end the way she thought it would, even if somewhere deep down, a part of her still wished he would run after her and prove that she was wrong. Walking away is easy until you realize you have nowhere to go, and as Emily Carter stepped onto the quiet street outside the Hayes estate, the weight of that reality settled in with every step she took, her hands still slightly trembling not from fear, but from the effort of holding everything together when it would have been easier to fall apart, because she had done that once already and she knew exactly where it led. A small apartment filled with silence and disappointment, a life built on trust that vanished in a single moment, and she refused to let that happen again, even if it meant starting over with nothing but the clothes she carried and whatever strength she had left. And yet no matter how far she walked, she could not fully escape the memory of the past few days, the way things had slowly begun to change between her and Alex, how what started as tension had turned into something softer, something real. Like the evening, he found her sitting by the edge of the pool long after her shift had ended, her shoes off, her feet barely touching the water as if she needed to remind herself that something in her life could still feel calm. And instead of sending her away or questioning her presence, he sat down a few feet away, without saying anything at first, just letting the quiet exist between them until it no longer felt uncomfortable. And when he finally spoke, it was not about work or expectations or rules. It was about her, about how someone like her ended up, carrying so much alone. And for reasons she did not fully understand, she answered him honestly, telling him pieces of her story she had not shared with anyone else, not even Jason when they were together. And instead of judgment, Alex listened, really listened, in a way that made her feel seen in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. And from that night forward something shifted. Small gestures that did not seem important at first began to mean everything, like the way he made sure she had water on hot days when the temperature climbed past 90 degrees, or how he quietly adjusted her schedule so she would not have to work the longest hours under the sun, never making a big deal out of it, never asking for anything in return. And Emily found herself noticing him too, the way he carried responsibility like it was second nature, the way his confidence never turned into arrogance, the way there was always something unspoken behind his calm expression, as if he was protecting more than just his business. And for the first time since everything fell apart with Jason, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to trust someone again, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. And maybe that was why it hurts so much now, because the connection they built was not something she imagined. It was real, built through moments that could not be faked. And yet all it took was one carefully crafted lie to make it crumble. And as she reached the end of the long road leading away from the estate, Emily stopped for a second, looking up at the darkening sky, reminding herself that she had survived worse than this, that she had rebuilt her life before and she could do it again, even if it meant starting from zero, even if it meant letting go of something that once felt like it could have been everything. Because sometimes strength is not about holding on, it is about knowing when to walk away, even when every part of you wishes the story had ended differently. Sometimes the hardest part is not losing everything. It is realizing you almost had something real, and it slipped away before you could hold on to it. And as Emily Carter sat on a worn wooden bench at a quiet bus stop nearly 2 miles from the Hayes estate, she replayed every moment in her mind like it might somehow change if she looked at it differently. But the ending stayed the same. Alex had believed Jason. And no matter how much those days between them had felt genuine, doubt had been stronger than trust when it mattered most. And the more she thought about it, the more she hated how much it still affected her, because she had promised herself she would never let another person have that kind of power over her again. Yet here she was, staring down an empty road with nothing but a small bag at her feet and a future she could not quite picture yet. And still, despite everything, her thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the way his voice sounded when it softened unexpectedly, to the quiet moments that no one else saw. Like the morning he found her struggling with a broken filter system near the deep end of the pool, her hands covered in grease and frustration, and instead of calling someone else to fix it, he rolled up his sleeves and crouched down beside her, asking her to explain what she had already tried, actually listening instead of taking over. And when the system finally clicked back to life, the look he gave her was not impressed. It was proud, like he respected her for figuring it out herself. And that small moment stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit, because it made her feel capable, not invisible. And then there was the afternoon, when a sudden summer storm rolled in, rain falling hard enough to blur the entire property in a matter of minutes. And she had been caught outside with nowhere to go until Alex appeared with an umbrella, holding it over both of them as they walked across the wide stone patio, their shoulders almost touching, the silence between them comfortable in a way that did not need to be filled. And she remembered thinking that if this was what trust felt like, maybe it was worth the risk after all. And that was the thought that made her chest tighten now, because she had taken that risk, even if only in small ways. And it had still ended the same way it always did, with someone choosing not to believe in her when it counted, and a quiet frustration built inside her, not just at Alex, not just at Jason, but at herself for hoping things could be different this time. And yet beneath that frustration was something else, something she could not ignore no matter how hard she tried, a lingering question that refused to go away. Because if everything between her and Alex had been as real as it felt, then why had he let it go so easily? Why had he not stopped her? Why had he not asked even one question before deciding who she was based on someone else's words? And as the distant sound of an approaching bus finally broke the silence, Emily picked up her bag slowly, her movements steady even if her thoughts were not, telling herself that answers did not matter anymore, that closure was not something she could wait for, that moving forward was the only choice she had left. But deep down, in a place she could not fully shut off, there was still a part of her that wondered if this was truly the end, or just the moment before everything changed again in a way she could not yet see. The moment doubt settles in, it does not leave quietly, and back at the Hayes estate, Alexander Hayes stood alone on the terrace long after Emily had disappeared beyond the gates, the city lights stretching out in the distance but offering no clarity, because something about the way she looked at him before she left did not match the story he had just accepted. It was not anger, not desperation, but disappointment, the kind that lingers longer than any argument, and that expression stayed with him, replaying in his mind with every passing minute, making it harder to ignore the uneasy feeling building beneath his calm exterior. Because Alex was not a man who made careless decisions. His entire life had been built on reading people correctly, on understanding motives, on seeing through half-truths before they had a chance to become problems. And yet tonight, he had made a judgment faster than usual, faster than he was comfortable admitting. And as he turned away from the empty driveway, he tried to justify it, reminding himself of Jason Miller's confidence, the way his story had been delivered without hesitation, the details that seemed too specific to be fabricated. But the more he thought about it, the more something did not fit, because Emily had never asked him for anything, not once, not even when it would have been easy, not even when he knew she was struggling more than she let on. And that was what made this situation feel wrong, because if she truly had an agenda, she had hidden it better than anyone he had ever met, and Alex was not used to being wrong about people, which was why the doubt now felt heavier than it should have, pulling his attention back to moments he had overlooked at the time, like the way she reacted the first day he questioned her intentions, not defensive, not manipulative, but steady, almost like she had nothing to prove. And then there was the night she told him about losing everything. The way her voice did not seek sympathy, only honesty. And he remembered how real that felt, how it did not sound like a performance. And now those memories were starting to clash with the version of her that Jason had painted, creating a tension he could not ignore no matter how much he tried to move on from it. And without realizing it, Alex found himself walking back toward the pool area, the place where most of their conversations had happened, where everything had started to shift. And the stillness of the water reflected back a version of him that did not look as certain as usual. And that was when he noticed something small but impossible to dismiss. The maintenance log clipboard Emily always kept neatly organized was still sitting exactly where she left it, untouched, with every entry carefully written, every task completed without exception, no signs of shortcuts, no signs of carelessness, just quiet consistency. And for a moment, Alex just stared at it, because people who planned to deceive did not usually leave behind a record of diligence that could easily be checked, and that realization made something tighten in his chest. Not panic, not yet, but something close to it, because if he had misjudged her, even slightly, then the consequences were not just about being wrong. They were about what he had already allowed to happen. And as the weight of that thought settled in, Alex reached for his phone without hesitation, scrolling to a contact he had not expected to call tonight, knowing that answers would not come from assumptions. They would come from facts. And for the first time since Emily walked away, he felt a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the possibility that he had just let something real slip through his hands because he chose to believe the wrong person at the exact moment it mattered most. Truth has a way of surfacing when you stop trying to control the narrative. And as Alexander Hayes stood by the quiet pool with his phone pressed to his ear, he realized he was no longer interested in protecting assumptions. He needed clarity. Real clarity, the kind that either confirms your judgment or forces you to confront the possibility that you made a mistake. And as the call connected, his voice remained steady, but there was an edge beneath it that had nothing to do with business. He asked for a full background check on Jason Miller, every detail, employment history, financial records, any inconsistencies. And when he ended the call, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, because now he had committed to knowing the truth. And there was no turning back from whatever that truth might reveal. And while Alex waited, his mind kept pulling him back to Emily, not to the version described by Jason, but to the version he had experienced himself, the one who never crossed a boundary, the one who never asked for favors, the one who looked at him like she saw the person behind everything he had built. And that memory stood in sharp contrast to the accusations he had accepted too quickly, creating a tension that made it impossible for him to simply move on. And miles away, Emily sat near the window of a nearly empty bus. The hum of the engine steady but distant as the city passed by in blurred lights and unfamiliar streets, her reflection faint against the glass, a reminder of how quickly life could shift from something hopeful to something uncertain. And she kept her gaze forward, refusing to let her thoughts drift back too far, because every time they did, they circled back to the same question she could not answer, not why Jason lied. She understood that well enough, but why Alex believed him without hesitation. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized it was not just about him. It was about a pattern she could no longer ignore. The way people seemed to define her based on circumstance instead of truth. The way her position in life made it easier for others to assume the worst. And that realization did not break her. It hardened something inside her in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary. Because if she wanted things to change, she could not rely on someone else to see her worth. She had to build a life where it was undeniable, where no one's opinion could take it away in a single moment. And as the bus came to a stop in a part of the city she barely recognized, Emily stood, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, stepping off into a quiet street, lined with small buildings and dim lights. The kind of place where people kept to themselves and asked few questions. And for the first time since she left the estate, she allowed herself to breathe without that constant weight pressing down on her chest. Because even though she had lost something that mattered, she had not lost herself. And that was something she refused to let anyone take again. And back at the estate, as the minutes turned into an hour, Alex's phone finally rang, breaking through the silence with a sharp clarity that made everything else fade away. And when he answered, the information that followed did not come as a dramatic revelation. It came as a series of small inconsistencies, gaps in Jason's story that did not align, timelines that did not match, claims that could not be verified, and each detail added to the growing certainty that something had been manipulated, something had been staged. And as the call ended, Alex stood there for a moment, processing what it meant, because if Jason was lying, then Emily had been telling the truth, and that realization carried a weight far heavier than any mistake he had made in business. Because this was not about numbers or contracts, this was about trust, and for the first time in a long time, Alex felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: regret, not just for being wrong, but for the moment he chose not to question what he was told, and the realization that he might have lost someone who had never once given him a reason to doubt her. The worst mistakes are the ones you cannot undo with a simple apology, and as Alexander Hayes stood in the dim light of his office, the truth settling heavily around him, he understood that this was not a situation he could fix with a conversation or a quick explanation, because the damage had already been done in the one moment that mattered most. The moment Emily needed him to trust her, and he did not. And now every second that passed felt like it was putting more distance between them, distance that might become permanent if he did not act quickly. And for a man who built his life on control and precision, the uncertainty of not knowing where she was or how to reach her was something he was not used to facing. But instead of hesitating, Alex moved with purpose, calling his assistant, asking for any information they had on Emily Carter, any contact, any address, anything that could lead him to her. But the answer was not what he wanted to hear, because Emily had kept her life simple, minimal, leaving little trace behind beyond what was necessary. And for a brief moment, frustration flickered beneath his calm exterior, not directed at her, but at himself for not asking more when he had the chance, for not paying attention to the details that now mattered more than ever. And as he ended the call, he realized that finding her would not be as straightforward as he hoped. But that did not mean he would stop trying, because this was no longer about curiosity or interest. This was about making something right before it was too late. And across the city, Emily sat alone in a small diner tucked between a gas station and a convenience store. The kind of place that stayed open late for people who had nowhere else to go, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of her that had long gone cold. But she had not touched it in a while, her thoughts too occupied to notice something as small as temperature. And even though she told herself she was moving forward, there were still moments when her mind drifted back, not to the pain, but to the possibility of what could have been. And that was what made it difficult, because losing something real always feels heavier than losing something you never believed in. And as she stared out the window at the quiet street, she reminded herself again why she could not go back. Why, even if Alex showed up right now with an explanation, it would not erase what happened, because trust is not just built through moments. It is proven in the moments when everything is uncertain, and he had chosen doubt, and that choice mattered. And yet, despite everything, there was still a part of her that wondered what he was thinking now, whether he had already moved on, whether he even questioned what he had been told. And that small, unwanted thought lingered longer than she expected. And back at the estate, Alex stood once again near the pool, the place that now felt less like a symbol of calm and more like a reminder of what he had lost. And as he looked out over the still water, he made a decision that went beyond his usual calculated approach, because sometimes waiting for the perfect solution means losing the chance to act at all, and he was not willing to let that happen, not this time. And without overthinking it, he grabbed his keys, stepping away from everything familiar, everything controlled, and into a situation where the outcome was uncertain. But one thing was clear in his mind. He was going to find Emily Carter, not because it was easy, not because it was guaranteed to fix anything, but because some mistakes are worth chasing down, even if you do not know whether you will be forgiven at the end. Sometimes the only way to fix a mistake is to face the person you hurt and accept whatever comes next. And as Alexander Hayes drove through streets he rarely noticed before, far from the polished neighborhoods he was used to, he realized how little he actually knew about Emily's world, the places she moved through, the life she rebuilt without anyone's help. And with every mile, that realization settled deeper, because finding her was not just about location, it was about understanding what she had been carrying long before she ever stepped into his life. And after hours of searching through the few leads he could gather, one small detail finally gave him direction, a temporary address linked to a short-term rental near the edge of the city, the kind of place people used when they needed a quiet reset, and without hesitation, he followed it, pulling up to a modest building that looked nothing like the environments he was used to, simple, practical, unnoticed, and as he stepped out of the car, the air felt different, heavier with uncertainty, because for the first time, he was not sure how this would end. And inside, Emily sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a small room that barely held more than the essentials, her bag resting against the wall, her phone silent beside her. And for the first time since everything happened, she allowed herself to sit still without forcing her thoughts in any direction, just letting the quiet exist, because she needed that space to decide who she wanted to be next, not who she had been defined as before. And just as she was beginning to settle into that stillness, a soft knock at the door broke through it. Unexpected, deliberate, and for a second, she did not move, her mind running through possibilities before she even stood up. And when the knock came again, she took a slow breath, crossing the small room and opening the door just enough to see who was on the other side. And the moment her eyes met his, everything she had been trying to hold steady shifted again, because Alexander Hayes was standing there, not in a suit, not composed behind distance and control, but real, present, and for the first time since she met him, uncertain, and neither of them spoke right away. The silence stretching between them filled with everything that had been said and everything that had not. And finally, Alex took a step forward, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper than she had ever heard from him before. He told her he was wrong, not in a way that excused what happened, but in a way that owned it completely, explaining what he had learned, the inconsistencies, the truth about Jason. And he did not rush through it, did not try to make it easier than it was, because he knew it was not about proving he had the facts now. It was about acknowledging that he should have questioned things before she ever walked away, and Emily listened, every word landing with a weight she could not ignore, because this was what she had needed in that moment at the estate. Not now, not after everything had already broken, and when he finished, the quiet returned, heavier than before, and she looked at him not with anger, not with immediate forgiveness, but with a clarity that came from understanding exactly what had been lost. And the question was no longer whether he knew the truth. The question was whether that truth came too late to change anything at all. The truth can arrive at the right time and still feel too late. And as Emily Carter stood in the doorway of that small room, looking at Alexander Hayes with a calm she had fought hard to regain, she realized that this moment was not about what he had discovered. It was about what he had chosen before he knew it. And that difference mattered more than anything he could say now. And for a few seconds, neither of them moved, the weight of everything that had happened settling into the space between them. And when Emily finally spoke, her voice was steady, not raised, not emotional in the way he might have expected, but clear in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. She told him that she believed him, that she had never doubted he would eventually find the truth, because he was the kind of man who did not leave things unresolved. But that was not what hurt. What hurt was that when it mattered, when she was standing right in front of him, needing him to trust what he had seen with his own eyes instead of what someone else told him, he hesitated, and that hesitation changed everything. And Alex listened without interrupting, because he knew there was nothing he could say to undo that moment. No explanation that could replace the choice he had already made. And for the first time in a long time, he did not try to fix it immediately. He simply accepted it, standing there with a quiet understanding that sometimes the consequences of a mistake are not meant to be avoided. They are meant to be faced. And Emily continued, explaining that she had spent too much of her life being defined by circumstances she could not control, by what people assumed instead of what they knew. And she had promised herself that she would never again stay in a place where she had to prove her worth to be believed, and even though what they had shared felt real, even though part of her still wanted to believe that it could be something more, she could not ignore what had already happened, because trust is not just about how someone feels when things are easy, it is about what they choose when things are uncertain. And as those words settled in, Alex felt the full weight of them, not as a rejection, but as a truth he could not argue with. And instead of pushing back, instead of asking for another chance he had not yet earned, he nodded slowly, his voice quieter than before as he told her that he understood, not just the situation, but what it meant for her to walk away now. and that if earning her trust again was even possible, it would not come from words, it would come from time, from actions, from consistency, and he was willing to accept that, even if it meant starting from nothing. And something in that response shifted the atmosphere just slightly, not enough to erase the distance between them, but enough to change the direction of it, because for the first time, Emily did not feel like she was being asked to forgive something immediately. She felt like she was being given the space to decide what came next on her own terms. And as she looked at him, really looked at him, she saw not the man who doubted her at the estate, but the man who had shown up here without certainty, without control, willing to face the outcome instead of avoiding it. And while that did not fix everything, it mattered more than she wanted to admit. And after a long moment, she stepped back from the doorway, not as an invitation, but not as a refusal either, leaving the space open in a way that said this was not the end, but it was not a beginning yet either. And sometimes, the most honest kind of ending is not a perfect resolution. It is the possibility that something broken might still find its way back, if both people are willing to rebuild it the right way.